So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, depending where, of course, you are joining us from today. A very warm welcome from me. And for those who might not know me, my name is Connie Clare, and I'm the Community Development Manager at the Research Data Alliance. And I'm very pleased to be your host for today's webinar, which is organised by the RDA, or Research Data Alliance. And today's session is all about web accessibility and how we can make RDAs work, so our recommendations, outputs, and other digital content more accessible. We're very fortunate today to have a great speaker with us, Dr. Kim Ferguson from DANS and the RDA in the Netherlands. And I'll give Kim more of an introduction. Just before I do so, I just wanted to share a couple of quick housekeeping points. So, as you'll have seen, the webinar is being recorded and we will be publishing the presentation on the RDA web platform, so you will be able to revisit it and share it after the event. If you have any questions for Kim, you are welcome to drop them in the chat throughout the session so you don't forget them, and we'll try to address as many of those as possible during the Q&A session at the end. Just to remind you, at the RDA, we do have a code of conduct, which we will be adhering to throughout the session. So please, can I just remind you to listen carefully and respect different perspectives shared today. And if you are new to the RDA, welcome. And if you're not yet a member, you are very welcome to join. Our individual membership is free and open to all. And I should have put a link there in the chat. So please feel free to go through the website and to register. And just very quickly, an overview of the RDA. So we are a community-driven organisation or initiative that was established in 2013. And in that time, we've grown to comprise more, I think it's around almost 17,000 members now, spanning 150 different countries that share this common vision and mission, that our community members come together to openly share and reuse data across technologies, disciplines and countries to address the grand challenges of society. And together we work towards building the social and technical bridges that enable open sharing and reuse of data. And at the heart of everything that we do at the RDA are our 6 guiding principles of openness, consensus, inclusivity, harmonization. We are community driven and non-profit and technology neutral. And that means that all of the work created by the Research Data Alliance should be available for adoption and reuse by anyone, anywhere in the world. But of course, that doesn't always mean that they are digitally accessible. And so that is why we've invited Kim to talk today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Kim, who currently works at DANS, as I mentioned, which is the Data Archiving and Network Services in the Netherlands, which is an institute of the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences. And Kim is a research data management specialist, but she's also the community manager for the RDA regional group in the Netherlands, which is very active. Some of you might know that group. And Kim also has a background in biology, a PhD in genetics from Wageningen University. And she's passionate about open science and about disability advocacy in academia and has a lot of experience in running workshops and training sessions on disability and accessibility in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I feel that this is a very important session for us today. I hope we can come away with some information and insights and guidance on how we can make our work at the RDA, but also beyond, on our recommendations, outputs, and digital content more accessible. And on that note, I've spoken for quite a bit, so I'm going to hand over to Kim. And Kim, you can now share your slides and
Exactly.
start. Thank you.
Let's see. So the first thing that I'll share right now is there is a resource associated with, we're going to talk about this set of checklists. I've also put it in the chat. There's a link there. We're going to go through it together, not in great detail because that would take a bit more time, but we'll run through the basics. So I just wanted to put this up here that there is a checklist we'll see further. So thanks, Connie, for the great introduction. And just before we start, I always like to say when I give these talks, I'm using my own experience here as a disabled person, but also a lot of what we're talking about in terms of web accessibility, I don't rely on. So my disability is in a different sphere, but I do try to use resources that are generated by people with who need to use screen readers, so they know exactly what they're talking about, or people who have been trained in web accessibility. And so sometimes you'll see conflicting advice, and generally, what I always tend to fall back on is always provide options and always look for resources from recognized organizations like W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, that has a web accessibility initiative. So, with that in mind, first we're going to kind of just touch upon what is accessibility, what is web accessibility in particular, especially, we all work with the acronym FAIR. There's the word accessible in there. It's not that accessible. I always have to clarify that when we talk about accessibility in this context, we're really talking about making sure that things are usable, practical, and accessible by people with disabilities or disabled people. So broadly, web accessibility is ensuring that technology and the information communicated by web technology is accessible by people with disabilities. So that's things that exist like websites, web or board native or web-based documents such as Word documents or Google documents, slide decks, Excel spreadsheets that everyone hates, email, any type of communication. And especially in the last 10 years, we're also talking about smartphones as well as other smart or Internet of Things enabled objects. How are they accessible to people with disabilities who might not be relying on the same type of input that the people who design the products are? So in practice, then, web accessibility is referring to things like guidelines or best practices that can help web-based content be more usable and understandable. So the most one that you will hear that is often referred to in legislation is called the WCAG 2.0. That's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is a set of guidelines and standards that are community created and put out by the W3C. And so this one really refers to websites, and that can be helpful to people creating Word documents or Google documents or slide decks, but it's more for coding with HTML or CSS or websites. So then what we're going to talk about today is really related to the work that we do at the RDA within the working groups and the interest groups when it comes to collaborative documents that then lead on to recommendation and outputs. So the slide deck or the checklist that I've provided really relates to documents and slide decks. So, why bother with accessibility? That's a bit of a upfront question. I mean, first, legally, depending on where you're based, it might be the law, so to say. There might be laws if you work at a public institution that public facing output is required to be web accessible. That is the case in Europe. That is the case in the Netherlands. That is the case somewhat in the United States of America or Canada, where I'm from, but implementation, it varies. And also in terms of contractual agreements. So if you are funded by a large funding body, there might be some things related to making content available that is accessible or at least meets minimum standards. So that could be the case. Morals are personal. So it could really relate to your understanding as a person and how you want to exist within the world, that you want to be a part of this action. So it might be important to you. Ethically, we can consider this if we are working in a research space or in a citizen science space. This is part of responsible scientific practice and collaborative effort. And I like to tell people that unfortunately you've now attended this webinar, so you know about it, and now you're ethically responsible. You can't say you didn't know about it. And then finally, practically, and I say this with as much grace as possible, you should maybe future-proof your own work because you never know if you're going to need it. But also, there is a large overlap between the almost sometimes even search engine optimization and making things accessible because the same technological tools that we use to make things accessible are also used by machines in order to read content more easily. So when you're trying to make something more machine understandable, you're often needing to use the tools that make things more web accessible as well. So there's an overlap there. and also just yeah. And finally, it contributes to open science. There's the broad one, is if we want science to be as open and representative of the world that we live in, we should be making our work understandable and accessible to everyone. There's the big argument, the big let's come together argument, you know? And we'll touch on later about the practicality of this and how much effort is required, and there is effort required. I'm not saying there isn't. But for now, let's just go check out the checklist, and we're gonna have some, let's see, stop sharing so I can quickly go to the checklist and share that instead. Okay. All right. So here we're on Zenodo, and I'm just going to go into full screen here and zoom in a bit. So I first made this checklist back in 2024 as part of the RDA Tiger project that Dunce was a part of with the RDA as well, talking about how we can improve the outputs and recommendations that are part of the RDA group outputs. And I've since updated this list as of last week, just for you guys. So I've updated it because in talking with Connie as well as other folks that I know who are in working groups, so much of the effort is done in collaborative workspaces like Google Docs and Google Slides. And most of my advice previously was heavily reliant on a tool within the Microsoft suite of programs called the Microsoft Accessibility Checker. And so I wanted to update my advice to include specifics both for Microsoft as well as for the Google suite. I will say that the Google suite requires a lot of effort to make it accessible, and that's partially just because the way that Google does things is very visually focused, adding new text boxes, clicking on things, very visual, that aren't necessarily supported by the infrastructure when it comes time to make it an accessible output. So you got to do a little bit of cleanup. But the majority of the checklist is split into two. There is a checklist for slide decks, and then going down, there's a checklist for documents. And it is broken up into kind of different approaches to consider. There's also a lot of resources in this checklist, both explicit for the program or the suite that you're using, as well as just general thoughts to consider. So the first is things like slide structure. And again, we're not going to go through it word by word because this is intentionally text heavy. I wanted a checklist where people could read it almost like a narrative to try and understand exactly what needed to happen. The accessibility checker itself within Microsoft will also kind of hold your hand and go through this process and understand why it's important. But a lot of the times you might be working without access to the accessibility checker, or you're working in, say, Libre, which is usable for Linux, and then there isn't an accessibility checker. So it's good to know what to consider. So we go through slide structure, different text formatting, and like this advice has really changed in the last 10 years because of Zoom. You know, the advice for slides used to be when you are projecting into a large space and you have a huge screen that people are sitting around and looking at, or they're looking at the slides later. And not really now, folks could be joining a meeting from their mobile phone, and that's fine. But then that means we really need to make the text even bigger because we have to consider the scale that people might be viewing the presentation. So I always talk about at least this size, but could be bigger, you know. Things like color and contrast. I will never pretend to be a graphic designer. The color choices I make are suspect at best, but a lot of the times I actually just use built-in theme coloring, and I can check things with this tool called the WebAIM Contrast Checker to make sure there's a high enough contrast between the background text and the font that I'm using. There's also a great tool that I'll refer to. Sometimes we use images that were either created by someone else or are created in a tool that we cannot easily change the colors of, but we want to make sure that an image can be seen by people who either have red-green color blindness or they require high contrast in order to understand material. Infographics are a huge part of the work that we do, but we want to make sure that infographics can be legible. Right. So this tool, VisCheck, will allow you to upload a copy of the image and then it will check it using an algorithm. And like this tool has existed for the last 20 years. So it's not generative AI at all. You can use that as well if you want, but it's really just checking to see if the colors that are sitting next to each other are able to be distinguished according to math. And then if it's not, it will offer you an altered image, either with colors slightly changed or with additional stippling in order to improve the image. I will say you have to make sure that you have the ability to change this image. So if we're talking about a creative contents license, you need to be able to do a derivative because changing the image would be considered making a derivative. So that's the one limitation there. Let me just check. I saw the chat. Oh yeah, AI seems to not consider these guidelines. Yes. And we can definitely talk about that as why you've never heard of these recommendations before. There's reasons. Um, Otherwise, there's something big when it comes to slide decks and documents, and also things like social media. And that's what's called alternative text or image description. Sometimes it's called image description. Sometimes it's called alternative text. Alternative text refers to when it's used in HTML, but it means the same thing. And that's if an image, if you remember back, so I'm 37. I remember broadband. I remember dial-up. I remember when images wouldn't load and you would just have like a broken image file and you'd be like, I don't know what's here, what's going on. It's the same thing. If you cannot visually see an image, how to understand the context of it, especially if it's relaying important information. And that's what alternative text does, is it is a text tag that is embedded within the image's metadata that explains what's in it. And it's best if that's written by the person who understands the image best, not necessarily by AI, because context is key. If there's a large infographic, you could write 5 paragraphs about what it's telling, but no one needs that. Really, what's the point you're driving home? And sometimes you have images that are just there for decoration. They're there to make it look nice. You can either leave it empty if you're using Google Slides, which is a drawback of Google Slides because it will just say image, or in Microsoft, you can mark the image as decorative or decorative, and then it doesn't come up when someone's using a screen reader, and that really helps the flow of viewing a document or receiving a document through screen reader is getting rid of images that don't need to be explained. So there's a great decision tree from the W3C that just goes through like, does this image need description and what should that description look like? There are tools that help you generate text for it. It does need to be what we would call a human-led process. You need to give some context. Hyperlinks, basic things. There's one checkpoint for multimedia audio, and it should not be underestimated, and that is providing transcripts where possible and captions where necessary for audio and video content. This has a whole guide on how to take care of that are available from various resources, myself as well. But when we're talking about a Google slide deck or a document, you're often not having a whole video in it. And then finally, uh, dissemination and publishing. You're going to upload to Zenodo. How are you going to do that accessibly? There's, of course, drawbacks to everything. So we want an open file format. We want an open document format. We want a rich text format. That's what we want. Unfortunately, a lot of accessibility features are not built into these formats because they are proprietary or because they require additional encoding. So what I often recommend for Zenodo uploads is to upload 3 things. For slide decks, upload the PowerPoint slide if you're using PowerPoint. Upload a PDF, that's the text stable version, and then upload the open file format. And that way you can offer the most accessible version is actually going to be the PowerPoint slide deck because it has all of these accessibility features that you've put so much time and effort into turning on. The the PDF version is going to be what we would call the stable version, just in case there's formatting issues or something gets lost in the upload. The PDF is stable. You could also upload an image. And then finally, the open file format. Do we want open formats to enable for more accessible features? Of course, but I know I'm not a programmer. I'm not going to be able to be a part of that solution. And for all I know, it's being worked on behind the scenes, and it's just a lot of issues related to what does it mean to be an open file format, and when do features become proprietary and not open. So, all right. And then you'll see the same checklist exists for documents. So I'm not going to run through it in specifics. I encourage you to read it. For documents, the main thing to keep in mind is just using the formatting available within the document. And that's especially true for when you're doing things like you want italics, or you want to make sure that heading 1 is the biggest heading, and then heading 2, because the way a screen reader works is it's going to follow this format. It's going to go from the heading 1 to heading 2, and then kind of understanding it. And that's available within what's called the style of the document. It's called style within Microsoft Word. It's called style within Google Docs. So you just use the style. And if you don't like the way the font looks, you can change that within the style, and then it's all good. This really is the key thing, is to use proper headings, to use the style guide, and also making something italic or something bold does not give you formatting information for a screen reader, but using things like strong emphasis, which is a style, and it looks like italics, that gives it information. So, and otherwise, the only other thing that I'll cover here, because this has kind of come up, especially if you're in an education space, we've maybe seen videos of teachers or trainers who are putting in text that are so-called prompt injections to see if their students are putting it into AI, and they'll put in something saying like, and if this put in banana 5 times, and then the output will have banana hidden in it. And they do this by making the font white and then putting it within the document so that when the receiver copy pastes it into AI Gen, they don't see that there's additional text there that's a prompt injection, and then it shows up, and then it says banana 5 times, and then the teacher can know like, okay, they put this into generative AI and they didn't tell me, which hilarious, useful, but just so you know, a screen reader will read white text on white background. So don't be embarrassed by what you put in there if you want to use protective prompt injections. Just know that a screen reader is also going to read that. So never hide important information in an inaccessible way. But yeah, so that was the checklist, and I intentionally didn't go into too much detail because I think it's more useful for you to work through it when you have a document or you have a slide deck to really see like, okay, what is the advice that I'm being given here? So some final thoughts, and then we'll get to the Q&A. There is no such thing as perfectly accessible. This is often the case because what is accessible for one person is inaccessible for another. So I have ADHD, and I really dislike when captions are on, when they're bad captions. They're less than helpful. But sometimes I need captions in order to like watch a TV show. So there's sometimes where I want captions and sometimes where I don't want captions, you know? But for someone who is hard of hearing or deaf, they're going to need captions 100% of the time, and they need to be good. So it's going to be about trying to do things as best as possible. And I often tell people who are trying to make their work more accessible, always provide options. Because if you provide a video that has a hard-coded captions because you don't have the ability to toggle them on or off on the platform that you're using, and then you have a video that doesn't have any captions at all, someone can decide which video they want to watch. So those are options. Same for the type of file that they want to access, you know, like providing those multiple file types means that someone can use the PDF, someone can use the PowerPoint, someone can use the open file format. All three are available. You likely have not been taught this before. This might be the first time you've heard it. Maybe you've heard it over the years, but you have likely not been taught it in a formal educational setting. When you were first learning how to use these tools, the Microsoft Accessibility Checker, for example, has been a part of Microsoft documents for the last 15 years, if not longer, but you might not have been taught that it exists. The reason for this is what we call ableism. It's trying to hide the fact that people use things differently, and we're required to legally provide it, but we're not going to tell people how to use it. That's its own issue that I also give workshops on what is ableism, but you shouldn't feel bad if you've never heard of this before. You didn't miss a class unless you happen to go to a school that taught it, or you know someone, or you yourself rely on these tools and then you know about it. It has never been part of a larger curriculum. And it's not part of the curriculum for content creators or computer scientists or computer engineers. They are often not taught this either. So feedback that you receive from disabled users or colleagues can trump the checklists at any time because they're telling you what actually works for them. Changing your practices takes time and effort, but it can save time in the future when you start working with accessible features and you reuse your slide decks or you reuse your documents. All of the work that you've done copies over to the next one, especially in terms of Microsoft documents or Microsoft slide decks. All of that effort will copy over when you reuse your slides. All of the alt text will come with it. All of the heading formatting will stay, so it becomes faster. However, this is effort, this is intention that should be recognized and budgeted for, either in time or in funding. So I'm not saying you should do this work on top of all of the volunteer effort you're already doing. You can make it part of the process, or you can let people know clearly, we need more time for this in order to make it accessible. That needs to be built into the timeline. And finally, if you're interested more in about web accessibility, I really recommend that you check out the resources and courses that are available from the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative. There is a course called Foundations. It is free. I've taken it. It can take a couple of days or maybe over a couple of weeks. You can return to it. It's available in multiple languages, and it really, you don't have to be a programmer to know what they're talking about. All of the advice is given in a very perception-based way to understand what people need and what people need access to in order to do the work that they need to do. So with that, we're on to Q&A, and I think it's best if I stop screen sharing the Q&A slide, probably, Connor.